Excellent. Hello, everybody, and thank you all for joining us today to hear about Open Syllabus. We've had another huge response to this webinar, so clearly Australia is very interested in open educational resources, and which is fantastic. So it's likely we'll have some more people joining as we continue on. But first, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet. I am today on Wadawurrung country at the Geelong campus of Deakin, but I live in Mianjin, in Brisbane, which is the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. Let's get down to business. Today, I've invited Joe Karaganis, who's the founder of Open Syllabus, to come and talk to us about what Open Syllabus is and does and can do for us in terms of understanding what we are using in terms of open materials and how we can find open materials. Open Syllabus is another of those resources. Could we please mute? I can hear somebody talking. Open resources that my research colleagues and I uncovered when we're investigating the question about whether open monographs are being used for the purposes of teaching and learning. So Sarah Barkler, Kay Steele, and Richard White and I have been looking into this. We're going to be doing a presentation at the LARC Symposium next week, and we've written a little blog which I'll put into the chat, the link into the chat. So that you can have a sort of teaser about what we're going to be discussing. But today, what we're going to be doing is, if we can stay muted for the time that Joe's speaking, if you've got some questions, please put them in the chat and we can open the floor up for discussions once he's done his presentation. And I think that's everything I need to do in terms of our introduction. So Joe, I'll leave it to you. Take it away.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll give a brief overview of what Open Syllabus is and talk a bit about its applications in particular to open educational resources and open access. This is an area I've worked in for a long time from a number of different directions. And, I think at any point, if you want to pop a question into the chat, I'll try and answer it. I think I'll be covering a lot of territory and I do want to try and be responsive to your questions. There are a lot of rabbit holes to go down here, most of which you can explore yourself. Everything I'm going to show you, or almost everything, is online and available for anyone to explore. Some of that requires a sign up, but it's free, and I'd encourage you to do that. And if you'd like to follow up separately after with questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So, just to give you a bit of background, Open Syllabus is a nonprofit. It's been a nonprofit for 5 years, and prior to that was a research project at Columbia University where I was based. We began really just with the question of whether we could begin to collect syllabi or their equivalent documents in large numbers and begin to make sense of them. Syllabi have been an object of interest forever. They're super rich distillations of expert opinion about what's central and peripheral to fields. The faculty have been instructed for several decades in how to abstract from class assignments into lists of concise learning outcomes. And they're just the richest document of that half of what the university system does, which leaves very few other traces. The universities conduct research. Research, of course, has a very elaborate system of publication and recognition and metrics surrounding that. Teaching really doesn't, and so we were interested in the question of what we could learn if we could begin to approach that question at scale in ways that were analogous to the ways in which citation analysis had emerged on the research publication side. My own interests were, and really the interests of the other kind of co-founders of this work, had a lot to do with coming out of humanities programs at a time when the identity of the humanities, and in particular in the literary and historical fields that we were close to, had been highly contested for several decades, and often in terms of what was considered to be the canon and how that had changed over time. So we were interested in questions of field change, and we began to approach that question from the direction of looking for a way to treat syllabi as a representation of the field. So in all the ways in which the identity of fields gets debated, one very simple way to look at what a field is to say, well, it's the sum of the decisions about what to pass on, what to teach to the next generation of people who you're conveying the field to through teaching. So I'll touch on some of the ways in which that interest in fields has informed the work, but the other side of the work that I think is most germane to this conversation is around open educational resources. And my background, separate and independent from Open Syllabus, has been several decades of work on access to knowledge, particularly from the perspective of copyright. Where does copyright afford greater or lesser flexibilities to reuse and reuse work? How do students get materials from the materials that they need for their educations? What are the mix of strategies that sort of shape those practices? And so, I've been sort of adjacent to these questions for a long time, and in particular interested in the emergence of open scholarly work and open monographs. And as we began to build out the infrastructure for Open Syllabus, it became clear that we also had the potential to begin to track the adoption of OER and OA materials. And this, if I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, this is one of the interesting features of Open is that the fact that it can circulate freely, that anybody can distribute it, that it can be versioned at will, means that it becomes very difficult to track distribution and use. And so where in a commercial book market, it's possible to measure the point of adoption through a sale, and measure the demand for the title. There was no analogous point of measurable distribution to anchor questions of kind of supply and demand in the open world. And as we began to think through what this implied, I mean, in the context of some of the other efforts that I was involved in, we began to think that this was an obstacle. This was an obstacle to the adoption of open titles in the classroom at scale, in part because there was no, there were very few ways to understand what other schools and units and faculty members were doing. There was no shared way to express and measure the demand for titles. So we began to extract citation information from syllabi, and we began to map that against some of the available databases for open titles. And in our case, that refers primarily to the directory of open access books and the open textbook library, although we're beginning to layer in other sources since those are good but not kind of fully representative of everything that happens under the umbrella of an open license. And filter that information back into ways to begin to track demand, track it at the country level, at the system level, school level, within programs within schools, and at the individual class level. And use that information to provide a resource back to people who are working on questions of, adoption and use, but also production. So it becomes, decisions about production should reflect information about demand. That's how it works in a commercial book market. But that was, absent. And so, with relatively poor demand signals, it was unclear whether you were, whether somebody investing in the production of a new open title was doing so in a context where there would be, where there was a strong need. If you were a OER librarian tasked with promoting the use of these titles in your school, often, or in our experience, often that was a process of one-to-one advocacy with faculty, and often kind of reinvention of the wheel every time that a librarian had to do that across a range of different programs or classes. So the ability to scale this kind of data up does a few things. One, it can tell, it allows for the identification of gaps much more easily, where there are areas of especially the introductory curriculum, the general education curriculum in the US, where the concentration of efforts around OER have really focused to make sure that there are titles that cover all the basic classes. That work gets a lot easier if you know what's being used. The work of librarians tasked with promoting the use of these materials on their campuses gets easier when they can show successful use cases at peer institutions or analogous programs, so that not everybody has to reinvent the wheel every time when it's time to think about conversion of an organic chemistry class or a chemistry program to OER titles. It's much easier to do that when you can sort of leverage the work of your peers who've done it successfully in other places. So those are the kinds of information that we try to surface through our work. And I'll, rather than talk about it, it's much easier to, to understand what I'm talking about if I can walk you through it. Danny, can I share a screen?
Yes, so I think I need to make you a co-host. There we go. So now you should be able to. Sorry, I should have done that before. Is it working? Perfect. Yeah, we've got it.
I'm going to have a new Zoom request. Okay. Hopefully you're looking at
the
Open Syllabus splash page.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Good. If it seems like the screen is out of sync with what I'm talking about, let me know. I've had this happen before where the screen had frozen and I got 15 minutes ahead on my talk and nobody had been able to follow any of it. So I'll kind of cue that a few times. But this is the splash page of Open Syllabus, and at the moment it describes the three primary things that we do. What we do has sort of a number of stages, one of which is to collect syllabi or course outlines or unit outlines or whatever the local sort of nomenclature is for detailed descriptions of classroom activity. We do that primarily by scraping. So universities publish a lot of this material online, faculty publish a lot of it. 10 years ago, it was often the work of individual departments. There are a lot of sort of smaller efforts to build archives. We collect these documents wherever we can find them. Most of that is from publicly available university portals. We pull it all in. That's a syllabus database that now is around 21 million, of which only something short of 50% are from the US. So it is a primarily international collection at this point. I think Australia might be our sort of densest collection per capita of a lot of Australian syllabi, and in particular, primarily because Australian universities have been very good at putting archives online that contain this material with often quite a bit of historical depth. So it's both a large collection and a historically deep collection. And that's of personal interest to me. Somebody who's interested in the question of how fields change, the more depth, the better. And we can get at some of those issues better in Australia than we can in other countries. So Open Syllabus Analytics is the wrapper we've built around the syllabus collection. And if you go to Open Syllabus Analytics, this is the landing page. Now, it's the landing page if you're logged in. If you want to create an account, you can trial it, play with it. You'll get to a page like this. I'm logged in as if I were from Western Kentucky University, but if you're logging in from your own school, that will show your own that will show your school based on your email. And analytics really, it's kind of our roadmap to how we extract structured information from syllabi and how we've tried to make that useful to different, primarily faculty and library use cases. So you can navigate across these sort of 8 dimensions of the documents on the left, so syllabi, titles, authors, fields, and so on. And then on the right, we've built out kind of specialized views that are really more, somewhat more special. There's specialized interfaces that allow you to drill down into the data from the perspective of whatever it is the subject of the dashboard. So OER is one of those, and I'll show you what that looks like. Gender data is another. We have a trends database. You can do kind of n-gram analysis for looking at the frequency with which phrases or terms appear across the collection. And then the Learning Outcome Lab is forthcoming, but is really going to focus on skills. So we are in the process of turning every syllabus in the collection into a skills map that can publish out to any of the widely used publicly available skills taxonomies. And that is a way, there's a lot of interest in this question as a way of creating a kind of fungible layer over classroom activities that can be translated, so that courses can be the equivalence, the degree of similarity between courses can be better understood in terms of the skills makeup of each of the classes. You can do better walks from classroom to employment, and we'll make all that information available too. That's going to be a publicly available data set once we're done with the work. It's quite a bit of work ahead of us. So what Open Syllabus is at the end of the day, so continues to be a work in progress, but it is a set of curricular analytics, really wrapped up in Open Syllabus analytics that allows students, faculty, librarians, anybody involved in higher ed to explore the syllabus collection. And when we have a good school collection, it will generally provide you a better view of the curriculum internal to the school than anything the school has available. When we don't, it's still the best view you can get of what other schools are doing. So it provides both that sort of internal view of the curriculum for your own school, but for all the cases in which it's interesting to learn about what other schools are doing, it's I think unparalleled at providing those kinds of views. So just to give you a kind of brief tour of how this works, I mean, you can approach the database from the perspective of titles and how often titles are assigned. These are the top assigned titles in the collection. James Stewart's calculus is assigned 22,000 times in the collection. We translate that into a 1 to 100 score. So just to provide an easier way of understanding frequency than trying to interpret what it means to have 7,000 appearances or 300 appearances. The score just sort of translates that to a simpler 1 to 100 scale. And for what it's worth, this becomes a very powerful tool for faculty to claim credit for work that they do that has teaching applications. So this is another dimension of the work that was one of the things I was most excited about as somebody who has worked at the edges of the academy for quite a long time and done a lot of publishing in fora that were not traditional scholarly publishing, but took the form of reports or other things that weren't as readily recognizable. The idea that you could begin to capture work for applications of the work that were distinct from research had a lot of appeal. And we've been trying to socialize the idea that this is another important dimension of not just faculty performance, but also influence, and all of the ways in which faculty write, and all the sort of genres that they write in that are not research articles are deserving of recognition too. And one of the best ways to capture that is to try and capture the frequency with which other faculty members decide that work is important to the teaching process. So this is our teaching score for faculty. It's a faculty alt metric, and we're the only source of it. So I've been a little disappointed at the slow pace of uptake of this metric as a way of validating faculty contributions to things other than research, but it's there, and some of that is a function of meetings like this one, where this is an area where librarians have a role to play. In any case, you can drill down pretty deep into any of these titles, and you get to a title page that will show you what the title is most frequently assigned with. So this is a list of co-assigned titles. It's effectively a recommendation engine for course design. You can see where the titles, where we're picking up the most where the most appearances of these titles. You can see how that the use of the title has changed over time, what fields it's appeared in, and you can go to syllabi. So now I'm jumping over into the syllabus.
Sorry, Joe, we've got a couple of questions in the chat that
Sure.
are probably relevant to what you were just talking about then. So the first one was about there are some commercial publishers in the title list, and are they fully open or are they tied down by publishing agreements?
So we are mapping the universe as best as we can reconstruct it. So this is a database that covers all citation across all fields in every form that we can find. Open titles are a portion of that. So our ability to zoom in on on open titles in particular is a function of our ability to look at citations in general. So we have a citation database of around 200 million titles, books, articles, other media, and then for some of those we can also identify whether they circulate under an open license. And so, open then becomes a subset of titles in general.
Oh, I see. Right. So you've got the 100% of the titles that are recommended in the syllabi you have, of which a subset are open.
So if I want to filter for that, I'm not going to find an open version of Orientalism, but if you want to filter the titles, and why don't we just try Australia? So here are the top assigned titles in Australia, as represented in our corpus. And if we want to search by titles that are openly licensed, we get to a much smaller list, but a list that includes both textbooks as when they appear in the Open Textbook Library. So the Open Textbook Library is one of our sources of truth for what an open title is, or the DOAB. So it's a mix of monographs and textbooks, and we try and preserve that distinction because they're different communities and they serve different purposes in higher ed. So if you wanted to go into this title, for example, which I'm not familiar with, but maybe some of you are, it's open because it has a little open lock. This again is below is a list of the titles it's most frequently assigned with. So obviously it's assigned in a lot of primarily music classes. These are the schools where we've picked up the most incidents of assignment of the title. Again, you have appearances by year. There's a cliff here that I'll explain in a second. But again, you can jump to syllabus views that provide you a way of looking at the context in which that title is assigned. So, for us, the interesting jump, and I think the jump that is most interesting from the perspective of course design or curricular uses of this database, is to not just see what titles are ranked highly ranked, or to understand just their numerical counts, but to then be able to situate that in teaching context and understand how a title is assigned. So when we publish a syllabus, this is basically what we publish. We publish abbreviated, anonymized, descriptive content from the syllabus, typically a description, the learning outcomes, and the assigned titles. Sometimes a topic outline if there's a topic outline. And for us, that's a way of navigating the copyright and privacy issues around these documents, since we're collecting them without permission for the most part, relying on U.S. fair use provisions to make derivative use of this material. And we're not publishing the integrity of the document. We're not publishing the raw text or information that would lead directly to enable easy re-identification of the instructor. And for us, that has proven to be a pretty comfortable middle ground for how we work with these documents. We found it to be quite analogous to the ways in which Australian and many European universities publish out their catalogs anyway. So often this is a level of detail you will find in an Australian unit outline or subject outline. That's not in the US. The US will be bifurcated between very abbreviated catalog views and then very detailed syllabi without much in between. We don't need all the detail to do the kinds of things we want to do with these documents, but we've settled on something that not accidentally, but has effectively it looks a lot like the standard Australian practice for publishing out a catalog, a unit outline catalog.
Okay, there's a question that's quite detailed about types of searching, but there's a broader question, which is whether the ability to search this list is predicated on a subscription to the Open Syllabus site.
So we have built this around a kind of freemium model. So you can get to most of this data and do most of these types of searches without an account, just for free. There are some limitations on that. So we only show syllabi up to 2019. or we only show data up to 2019, and we don't show the syllabi. And so those are, for want of a better word, premium features that we hope are the interesting enough for libraries to consider subscription. So we are trying to move toward a subscription model. We've been grant funded to date, and that's been great. But the grants run out, and we need to be be working with institutions, both as subscribers to the services we're providing and as contributors to the archive we're building. And that's the other side of it. So we want schools to not just use and subscribe, but also to contribute to this archive. And there's another rabbit hole there I could go down, but we have a huge Australia collection that has fallen off in recent years because of the ways in which Australian universities have moved toward new systems for publishing out their catalogs that are harder to scrape. We will spend some time trying to recover that this fall, and I think in the next version of the data set, we'll recoup a lot of the sort of recent Australian data that we haven't been able to pick up through our more general methods. But you can see that in the representation of some Australian schools and titles that are common in Australia, where there's a cliff. That cliff is typically 2021. And that's just a reflection of being a small team that can't revisit every school in the world every year to update the coverage. But we try. And like I said, I think we'll be coming back to Australia with a pretty serious effort to recoup what has dropped out in the last couple of years. I can explain more about that, and it is relevant to the question of whether this has immediate utility to Australian schools. If, for example, we don't have good coverage of the school, then either the school has to derive enough value from the fact that we have good coverage of other schools, and there are a lot of comparative use cases there that matter enough to warrant a subscription. Usually there are, but it's a question. Or we have to rely on the school to provide its own records, and that's really where we would like to be increasingly. But it's always a conversation, and again, we're a very small team that managing lots of different university conversations is not something we can do very easily. But I will zero in on Australia here. So this is our Australian collection per school. These are the number of syllabi we've been able to collect from these schools, and some of them are very deep collections. So if you look at Monash, something strange has happened with the recent cataloging that Monash does, but we were able to fully capture an older set of catalogs that provides a very deep representation of Monash's curriculum, and that'll vary by school.
So there's a question there that is actually sort of at a school level, which is noticing that we can search for assigned books by author. And the question is how they deduped, and is that possible by publisher? And the reason for that question is because increasingly in Australia, we've had quite a successful program of publishing our own open educational resources. So there's interest in seeing how those resources are being used elsewhere. Is it possible to look at it from that direction?
Yes. So you can go to publishers. Now, I will say publisher is probably the least reliable field in these records. Often publisher records and library catalogs are just free text fields that people fill out however they want. At least that's the history of it. And so it's chronically messy data. So while it is, and then of course we conflate records. We're working at the title level, not the edition level. So as we build a kind of master catalog that represents the discoverable universe of titles to support this work, we want one representation of Plato's Republic, not 100. And so we may have 100 underlying records. We conflate them all into one record, and then treat that as the title, as for the purposes of open syllabus analytics. For people doing research in this area, we can provide data sets that break that down into editions insofar as we can discern differences in edition, which we can sometimes, but not always. But if you're looking at a particular publisher, yes, we can drill down into particular publisher records and histories. Most pages have a kind of, you know, top title view that would allow you to understand sort of curves of adoption over time. I'll jump over to the dashboard that focuses primarily on OER, and that can provide another view of this. So if you wanted to zero in on the top OER titles, that's easy to do from the OER dashboard. If you wanted to, I mean, there are lots of ways to filter. There are just tons of filters available that we've built out in function of user requests, really. I mean, we've added many of them over the last year as people discover new ways to search across the data that we didn't previously facilitate. So, you know, this is always sort of a dialogue with the users, and this tool set has changed a lot in function of user requests to make different kinds of searches more readily available. Probably the most important one from the perspective of OER is the difference between textbooks and monographs. So again, for us, this is a question of where we source the catalog record. If we source it from the DOAB, we call it a monograph. If we source it from the Open Textbook Library, we call it a textbook. If there is an Australian publisher that isn't well represented in either of those, then we probably can't find it. I mean, there's a lot of open material that hasn't been curated or well curated into the centralized catalog data sets. When we identify a new catalog that we need to incorporate, we can do that. But I don't know what the status of whether or not the titles you're referring to coming out of Australian schools fall into that category or not. I couldn't tell you. But basically, OER metrics is where we've kind of clustered together the dedicated views of open titles, so that if you want to look at time series data, the light blue is monographs. The dark blue is represents textbooks. If you want to look at that by we can do it for the U.S. That's what the U.S. open adoption curve looks like across the last. Well, I mean, the most of the action started in 2012 through 2013. From there, it's been rising at a rate of about 20% for textbooks. Monographs are a bit of a different story. It's been pretty stable. Canada shows a very similar curve. Australia, I don't know how to interpret this story. But to me, it looks like, again, 2014 and on has a decent and growing curve for open titles, open textbook titles. On the monograph side, I think the monograph data is too noisy again, partly because of that clip, but certainly it looks like a rapidly rising curve prior to the data drop off.
And if you want to know percentage, sorry, Joe, on the left-hand side is the percentage of the total of titles you have for those syllabi.
That's right. Good point. So this is, even in the best case scenario, these are very small numbers of total adoptions. You can get to, I mean, if you want to know where it peaks, and I will say we're reliant on the presence of good citation practices in these documents, which is not always the case. I'm aware of kind of category problems where we are undercounting open title data. For example, now I'm blanking on the name. The OpenStax titles, when they're cited, the author is sometimes the citation may be chemistry by OpenStax. We're dependent on chemistry plus an author's name, title plus author name. So if there's a good citation present in the document that says chemistry by whoever, we can identify that, and that counts as an instance. If it's chemistry by OpenStax is not a recognized author in our catalog, and so a certain number of those drop out. There are a number of problems of that type, especially with titles that have kind of group or shifting authorship over time, and which is often the case with textbook titles, or titles that have been versioned. I mean, this is why we've, both for good and for worse, relied on the fairly careful curation practices of the DOAB and the Open Textbook Library, where things that appear in those data sources generally pass through pretty conventional publishing practices and generate good records. So that means that we, there are edges to our view of the ecosystem, and those edges include things that don't get curated up the chain into those larger databases. There are things that may not have definitive authors because they've been worked on by many different hands over time. Things that are published at the school level within a department, or widely used in the department but not circulated beyond it, unless it has a catalog record that we were able to pick up through some other source, it's invisible to us. So there are a lot of, it sort of turtles all the way down. There's a lot of, every step in this process has issues, and we do our best to address them and stamp out the problems that we identify that we can stamp out. But we're dealing with a very heterogeneous range of sources and data sets, and pulling them together as best we can. And as best we can is, I think, as best as anyone can. I think this is the only capacity that I'm aware of for viewing aggregate data on OER adoption and open title adoption. But if you're curious what the absolute best case is for OER adoption, you're probably best off looking at two-year college textbook adoption in California. And if you really want to dig in, you can look at math. So this is sort of the best case scenario for open adoption right now. California has a very aggressive program for introducing open titles into its two-year college curriculum. And math is where there's the longest history of title development and use, and socialization of title use. So if you were curious about what those titles are, you can figure that out by jumping over to the title view. These are the texts used by California 2 years in math. If you wanted to know what schools those are, you can jump over to the school views. And so, a California use case might be if I'm at Reedley College and I want to know who's really doing a good job converting the math curriculum. I think that, the people to talk to are at De Anza. So that's a parallel use scenario in which hopefully we're surfacing information that allow librarians to understand where their peers are having success at converting over classes or whole programs to open titles. If you want to know what those syllabi look like, again, you can go to the syllabus view, and here we have again a fairly typical representation of the syllabus. For most of the descriptive fields are present here. So that is, I think, a very cursory tour of Open Syllabus analytics. There's a lot more here and a lot more depth. And I'd encourage you to sign up and explore it yourself. And like I said, the way we've structured it is anybody can use the sort of basic data set up to 2019 for free and without signing up. Then anyone can also sign up for a 30-day trial that gives access to this view of the full data set. And then after that, we hope that librarians will consider evaluating analytics for subscriptions. We don't have many Australian contacts. We have been looking to develop them and looking to develop them at the consortial level too, so that this can become a more standardized product for Australian use. But at the moment, we don't really have a vehicle for doing that. If you want to help with that problem, that would be great. That's sort of next on my list for how to try and work with the Australian higher ed community. I should point out we also we also break out learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are one of those things that often disappear at the course level. So mean, the way this typically works in curricular design is that a program or department will have its sort of program level learning outcomes that instructors are then tasked with interpreting. Those interpretations end up on the syllabi, and then they disappear. Nobody ever sees them again. Nobody ever knows whether faculty are adhering to the program level outcomes, whether there's drift over time, how you would begin to evaluate that. So we're beginning to tease that out. And the skills data set that I mentioned is going to be the one of the ways to do that efficiently. Just to give you a brief preview of two other pieces of work, the thing so Open Syllabus Analytics is not done. It's going to continually get better, but it is at the stage of fairly mature product. And our first. The second is something called the Course Matcher that's designed to support course transfer initially at US and Canadian schools, but again, the shape of the data is very similar for other countries, and we can build it out to Australia too. And here the goal is to begin to be able to work with course similarity as a way of looking at curricula. I'll just start that fresh. So these are 1,100 US schools. Just picking a couple at random. And we can then take the curriculum and map course by course similarity across the two course catalogs. So that if you're interested in transferring a course from Midwestern State to Tarleton State, we can show you the likelihood of, or the similarity between the two classes at the catalog level, which is typically just this description. That's what a catalog is in the US. It's a short description. If we have the syllabus, we can then show a more detailed view that can inform a transfer decision. So this gets into another kind of dimension of the work focused on course similarity. And of course, that's the problem of student mobility in a nutshell. How do we know that the courses they've taken are the courses that are available at our school? And we can begin to do that automatically and provide a resource for decision makers and students for whom this is often kind of a black box to be able to better understand curricular similarity across different schools and countries.
Many years ago, I did change my undergraduate degree, and that was a major problem for me personally. So I could appreciate this, although I do wonder within the highly competitive university environment in Australia whether that would be seen as problematic by some universities as well, you could do the same course at this other university that might not, that might be easier to get into, for example. I don't know, just a thought.
Schools retain their own discretion to make whatever decisions they want. This is just advisory, and it often provides a better resource than the schools themselves have available for evaluating these kinds of decisions. So often it's better in Australia because of the quality of the catalogs. You can do a catalog to catalog lookup and get a better indication than you can typically at a US school, but it's still quite sparse on this. In an Australian context, this would provide a way of bringing that together in one place for students and university decision makers, and then also provide the same kinds of articulations to every other school in the data set. So Australia to US and vice versa, Australia to UK and vice versa.
Interesting stuff. So Joe, so we've got 15 minutes, folks. So if you've got some questions, now's the time to start articulating them in the chat. But you did mention, Joe, earlier on that you were going to explain the cliff.
The cliff, right. So the cliff is a function of just the publication practices of Australian schools, many of which have moved toward a couple different commercial products that are just challenging to collect. So if I show you Melbourne, for which we have an enormous collection, that's a cliff that just reflects the university's changing publication practices for its catalog.
And wasn't there also something
Adelaide
in relation to Tallis in 2019? I vaguely remember from a previous conversation.
Yeah. So some of that is related to. We've also been collecting reading lists, and again, this goes to some of the heterogeneity of the collection. So schools that have adopted reading list software in the library now commonly split the representation of the class, where previously there would have been one document that was the description, the learning outcomes, the assessment information, and the reading list. That's our kind of modal document. That's the best. It's the best document from our perspective. With the growth of use of reading lists, that's now often split between a document that contains the descriptive information and a document that's called the reading list and managed through Talus or Leganto or a couple other similar tools. When Talus reading lists are available publicly, which many schools do provide publicly, we scraped them until Talus changed the way it manages the publication of these pages, and a few years ago that broke, and we stopped being able to collect comprehensive reading lists for Talus schools. Again, we're going to recover that. In fact, we're working with Technology for Sage now, and they'll be partnering with us in this, and all that information will come flowing back in, and in a context in which universities are made aware that this is what we can do with their data, and they're making it public anyway. So why not do all these other things with it too? Leganto is a different story. Very few Leganto using schools make this information public. So it's, what we're seeing is a growing use of very centralized tools for managing the curriculum, some of which are open, some of which are not, some of which are easy to collect, some of which are not. And whether we have a good school collection is really very dependent on just those choices of which tools the schools is using to represent its curriculum. What we'd like is for a school to decide that there are benefits here if it actively contributes. So rather than us haphazardly being able to scrape some portion of the school's courses or not, the school's already making this information public in some fashion, or most of them do most of the time. We'd like schools to contribute that directly to us. And then all these services become that much better because we're working with a validated source of data that it's clean, it's comprehensive, all the advantages that come with that.
And is that I can see the advantages of for an organisation to do that. Would that be something that is just you'd like that generally to happen, or is that something associated with becoming a supporter? What's the kind of relationship there?
We've treated these as separate conversations. So this, it's the decision to subscribe to Open Syllabus Analytics is a decision the library will make and can make unilaterally. Just if it receives, if there's faculty interest, the library can do that. The library is often not in a position to decide to contribute the catalog of unit outline archive, produce a version of the catalog that can be distributed to us. So just administratively, those tend to be separate conversations. That's unfortunate. It just means that it's that much harder. It'd be nice with the library if that could be done in one spot, and maybe there are places where it can, but most of the time we've treated these as separate tracks.
Fantastic. So have others got questions? And there might be questions about what you've seen, or about the supporter arrangement, or about, I can see that we might be able to find out this bit of information and you want to establish whether that's possible or not. You can unmute. I think we've finished the main chatty part. So if anybody wants to either put something in the chat, put up their hand, or unmute, feel free. I think that that's quite interesting what you're saying, Joe, though, about the sort of centralisation of some of these things like reading lists and so on, because you previously were talking about the question about centralisation of databases in terms of, like, we have quite a strong OER publication kind of drive that's happening at the moment in Australia, which has been very successful. And so obviously there's a need for us to ensure that those books are registered in Open Textbook Library, for example. So there's a place to centralise these things. Do you think that there's some work possibly into the future about being able to access material that might be in something like Leganto, or because that's a proprietary product, there's going to be problems there?
The school can decide whatever it wants. If the school wants to export its reading lists and send them to us, that's
Yeah,
their
no, I understand
prerogative.
that there's that going on. I'm just talking
Yeah,
about that is itself then becoming a kind of centralized database. It's just one that's not
it
openly accessible.
it it is. I mean, we have ongoing conversations with Leganto about partnering with them. Um, if that works out, then there may be an easier way to flip that switch. Uh, but yeah, I mean, I think generally, I think there's a movement to uh, well, to centralize control of all school data in gated IT systems. So you end up in a position where the school has to affirmatively decide to make it public, or it's private by default. And schools are not always making um, that deliberate choices in that regard. If the default is private, a lot of schools are just going to do that because that's how the IT department sets it up, and it seems like the lowest risk path for the administration. I think we've demonstrated pretty conclusively that um, there are advantages to publication of basic curricular information, and those fall across the spectrum, across a whole range of university functions, from teaching to student mobility to school to workforce transitions. And we're trying to build up the range of incentives that make it a very easy choice for a school to say, yes, we want that, and here's the data for you to provide it. And on our end, we want to be the curricular archive for this kind of work. I mean, there's an archival mission here that I think is consistent with university library missions, and we'd like university librarians to become advocates for these contributions at their schools. Um, but like I said, in general, we've treated that as a separate set of conversations from will the library subscribe, and are we providing not specific services to the faculty that may or may not have approached the library. Um, you know, we've tended to treat the faculty as the primary audience because these are so much of this is about curricular design and kind of faculty facing metrics. But we, we're what we've discovered over the last year is that the technology part is in some respects the easy part. The harder part is the marketing and the customer acquisition and the networking that allow us to work effectively within larger academic communities. And we're too small to do that effectively. So that's the context in which we're seeking out partnerships with library organizations. We are a member of, um, sorry, I'm blanking again on the name, but the library vendor associations,
Right, right.
uh, you know, partnerships with companies providing IT services to libraries, Technology for CH or Ex Libris. Those are the relationships that I think we need to build because they just have more boots on the ground talking with faculty and
Yeah,
libraries every day.
yeah. I know from my role with OPEN that these challenges.
Yeah.
We've got one last sort of at the last minute question, which is there a way to identify resources from other open platforms like Pressbooks, which is the one that we're using, by the way, in Australia, via a link to the resource using title and author, or some of these might be in the title list but not listed as open?
So Pressbooks is top of our list of other catalogs to integrate. Yeah, I mean the successor Pressbooks is something that well, it's a significant new contributor of new titles and not consistently curated by Open Textbook Library. So the short answer is yes. When we identify a new source of titles that matters to the community, we'll figure out how to integrate it. There's always a trade-off. I mean, the more diverse sources of data you put in, the noisier the signal you get out is, and particularly around that distinction between textbooks and monographs, which we've felt has quite a bit of use in the community. We're a little nervous about diluting it, but if if Pressbooks is what people are using, then yeah, we'll integrate Pressbooks. And the same is true of different local archives. There are a lot of state level archives in the US uh, where we've sort of recorded some interest in being able to track those. Um, in short, yeah, we're trying to be responsive to the needs of the community.
Fantastic. That's great. Thank you, Joe. Well, I think we're going to start wrapping up now because we're 4 minutes to the hour. So this is being recorded, and so I will send something out to everybody who registered. We've got, I don't know what our end number was in terms of registrations, but we had about 50 people attend today. And so I'll send that out and also send out some contact information for Joe. And let's continue the conversation. I think that certainly there's lots of interest and activity that's happening in open educational resources here in Australia. And I think there's a desire for us to understand a bit better what's going on. So hopefully that this has been useful for everybody. And I'd like to thank you, Joe, for staying up and feeding the cats early so that they didn't bother you at the door before you came online. So on behalf, I've got just a message from HSB. Thank you. Yes, it's a thank you. So on behalf of us in Australia, thank you, Joe, and have a very good evening.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Joe.
Have a good day.